Aha! This is Laborc, and it is so nice to have you here. These are the paints you need. It's okay, you can look at the mustache. I'm using the airbrush to give Hug the first layer of green. This is waagh flesh, a nice and cold green, so it will be great for the shadowy parts. I apply the paint mostly in a zenithal way, but I do cover the whole skin. I'm just not going for maximum opacity on every part. For the pants, I use Naggaroth Night. It's a dark cold purple. Don't need to be super precise with your airbrush. A little bit of overspray is quite okay. Purple is a great color for shadows, so I even sprayed some on the torso in an angle so I only hit the lower side of the muscles. Papa Laborc mixed some deathworld for us to the waagh flesh. This is a bit brownish green and sketches out the main planes of light. I'm going to use a desaturated and cold greens for this mini. The Hug's skin color varies on the green spectrum quite widely. If this character wouldn't be undead, I would go for that crazy neon lime look with greens that has lots of yellow in them, but since it's a dead body, I like to make him a bit more pale, and these colder greens are going to help me with that. I'm using thin layers for easier blending purposes and covering 80% of the skin with this color. Greatly sculpted mini, so want to have maximum definition on the muscles. I'm using these photos for highlight references. You can download this picture from my Patreon for free. I included the link in the description. But if you'd like to, you can support Papa Laborc for only €2 a month to have early access to these videos. These photos going to help you a lot with values and highlight placement, and to have a reference is the basic foundation for getting better at highlighting stuff. If you go to a beginner art class, they will teach you how to draw basic shapes like cubes, spheres, cylinders and cones, and they're going to provide a composition with these shapes that you can look at, because no one learned to draw just from his imagination. And the same rule applies for mini painting too. Did you guys ever see medieval lion paintings? It's the best. These lions look weird because guess what? During the medieval times in Europe, no one ever saw a lion, so they didn't have any reference on how they look like. Maybe some of them read about it, or talked with other painters who read about them, but they had to imagine what a lion would look like. So don't be the medieval lion painter guy and make reference photos for highlights. Offload your brush on a paper towel and move the brush from the lower to the higher value area. Same brush motion all the time, or I will slap on your tiny hand. Now we use pure deathworld forest to brighten up this bulky boy. As you see, the layers I'm using are thin, so I build up the opacity over time slowly. I'm looking at the highlight references and I'm looking at the mini on its own. There are some parts like the chest and the face where I would create bigger highlights or put higher value highlights which are not on the reference pictures. But Papa Laborc, how do you know where to increase the highlights intensity and where not to if those highlights are different on the reference picture? That is a very good question actually. The main trick here is contrast in values. I want to create a focal point around the head, and to do that I need to increase the values around the head and on the head itself. This way, when someone look at your mini, their attention will be drawn to the head first. Unless your friends are weird and they be like, I want to look at the guy's toenails, and you be like, who invited this guy? Do I know you? Now let's mix some necrotic flesh to the deathworld forest to push the contrast. This is a quite pale green, so it's awesome for our dead hog body. I like to use this paint for undead skin, and you can check out my variants for undead skin tutorials. I leave the links in the description if you are interested. It is very important to build up these highlights on the foundation that we created with our previous layers. So cover 70% of the previous layer and only increase the layer size where you want to make bigger and brighter highlights because you have a purpose for it. If Papa Laborc finds out you highlight everything unproportionally, and in the end your paint job looks bland because you didn't look at the highlight reference photos, I will go to your house and slap on your tiny hand, and then you will be there crying with your mediocre paint job. And Papa Laborc will be standing next to you being really upset about the whole thing. Use some glazes to smooth out the transition. Since skin usually a pretty smooth, you can go crazy with glazing, applying some extra layers so it will be silky smooth like granny's butt cheek. We use different shades of green with different colors in them, but it's easy to create something bland if we just push the values for a high contrast finish. We also need some tonal variation. Our stupid human brain loves color. It makes us happy for some reason. So I glaze some wine red over the shadowy parts and use this color to paint the parts where the flesh is more rotten and have these necrotic blisters. Red is complementary to green, so it will create an extra depth to these shadowy parts and makes them richer. Even if you glaze this accidentally over the highlights, it will look like some bruises on the skin, so you don't need to be extremely precise with it. Now for the more open and rotten parts, I use mephiston red in a base layer consistency. Then I cover the necrotic blisters with hobgrot hide. This is a base layer consistency as well. These are pretty well sculpted, so it's easy to paint them. Do you guys ever wondered how these blisters taste like? After that, I use squig orange to introduce some tonal variation to these rotten parts, focusing on those inner layers of muscle fibers. This will push the contrast a bit and create a more slimy and shiny look. To increase the luminosity of the skin, I glaze some yellow next to the highlights. This will make our green skin a bit warmer and more saturated. This is a very thin glaze, and as you can see, it makes a tremendous difference on the skin. I use the same wine red to paint the inside of the mouth. Apply a base layer consistency of ice yellow to paint the eyes. If you left the area around the eyes dark, it will create this disturbing evil look for the eyes. I really prefer this look. I don't want to paint the iris because it looks more evil like this, in my opinion. Highlighted the side of the tongue with a little bit of mephiston red. After that, I mixed some ice yellow to the mephiston red. It's a bright pink color which is great for the tongue to imitate a bit of moisture there, and use this to highlight some parts of the blister covered flesh and edge highlight the little holes on the skin to give them some extra definition. Then I painted the teeth with karak stone. I'm using this color because it's not too bright. Just like we painted Iron Man, we don't want to paint Hulk with shiny teeth since it's a zombie. Try to leave a little bit of separation between each tooth. This will make them nicely defined. I repainted the hair black, if you didn't use the airbrush for the green parts, but we don't really need green in his hair. After that, using the highlight reference photos, I did some highlights in his hair. I mixed some ice yellow to the black, but you can use a little bit of white too. We just want a darker grey to create some highlights. This is a thin consistency, but it's not too thin, so it covers nicely, and please remove excess paint from your brush so it won't run into the recesses of the hair, okay? Okay. Then I went back to the toenails. Remember that one weird friend who is super excited about them? Let's not disappoint him and paint those toenails nicely. My secret to any nail is that I use the mid-tone of the skin for the whole nail and then paint a tiny line with the second highest value highlight color I used on the mini. The other trick is to leave a little bit of black line around the nails so they will look nicely defined. All the nails are important, so don't skip them or I will slap on your tiny hand. Then we highlight the pens with xereus purple with a base layer consistency. Catch every fold that is facing up, but don't cover too much of the pens with this color because we want dark purple pens. I mean, I want to paint dark purple pens, but I'm sure you do too, okay? Okay. reduce the highlight areas with genestealer purple, or add some ice yellow to the previous purple you used and focus on the faults. As you see, as we push the values of the pens, the darker parts appear darker next to the highlights. Pretty cool effect. You don't need to stand up or anything, but if you like these videos, please consider supporting Papa Laborc on Patreon. Thank you. Since we used wine red on the shadowy parts on the skin, why not to do it on the pens too? So glaze some into the darker purple parts and it will bring some nice tonal variation. Yeah, Papa Laborc, but this color is not complementary to purple. Why use it for the shadows? Because you don't have to live by all the rules, you know. It's important to know the basics, but it's also nice to bend those rules and it looks really cool. And not only that, but since we use this color for the shadows on the skin, it will create a more integrated look. Now this part is purely optional, like any other stuff Papa Laborc says actually, but I glazed a little bit of fluorescent yellow over the eyes and the eyelids, but really just a tiny bit. So it's like a really faint glow effect, nothing crazy, but you know, if your friend check the toenails on the miniature, maybe they can appreciate these nuances. Now pushing the contrast more on the skin, I used some ice yellow and painted the brightest highlights. I'm using some thin lines and some stippling according to the surface I'm painting. Thin consistency like we used before, and try to push the values around the chest and shoulders mostly, and use smaller highlights for the hands and feet so the focal point stays on the head. Let's make those blisters shiny like it's Granny's eyes and paint a little dot on the top left part of them. It's very important with the spherical highlights to have consistency about the placement, so it will be believable that the light is coming from one direction. After that I took a break and came back to the mini. This is also very important when you are painting something to a relatively high standard. Take breaks. Look at it again with a fresh pair of eyes. I did that and realized I need more highlights here and there, so I worked more on the legs and hands. Following the same thought, I pushed the contrast just a tiny bit on the rotten parts, really focusing on the edges and applying it over the most recent layer. The rotten flesh looks really nice with all these deep red, orange and pink variations. The same goes for the pants. I realized I didn't focus much on the edges, so I painted them with genestealer purple. After that, I pushed the contrast with adding a bit of ice yellow to the purple to create these dramatic highlights. Thin consistency so we can blend them easily. I'm sure some of you can see the pattern now that we use the same colors for the highlights with ice yellow and wine red for the shadowy parts. This way our paint job has a more harmonic feel to it. The colors work together and it feels like every part of the miniature belongs in the same environment. Now it's time for the base. I cover most of the surface of the tiles with warpfiend grey with a base layer consistency. Remove most of the paint from your brush on a paper towel and let's switch to a dry brush because I want to use stippling and just roughly apply the paint to the surface. This is a fast and easy process. This will create texture, and since we painted the hug to a smooth finish, we want to create some contrast with the texture between the base and the character. I add some karak stone to the warpfiend grey to paint the highlights and switch to a smaller layer brush. I recommend you use a brush that you don't really care for, so don't ruin your expensive saber brushes, just get a crappy one. Same stippling motion, and don't forget to paint the edges of these concrete tiles. Now with pure karak stone, reduce the highlight areas and continue the process. This is a really simple and beginner friendly technique. All you have to look out for to not use too much pressure on the brush and don't let your paint be too runny. You need a consistency that you can control easily. For the huge metal and for those bucket shaped helmets, I used doombull brown with a dry brush again to create texture. We want to make those look rough. I highlight them with skrag brown with the same technique and keep in mind the shapes while highlighting. The flat parts receive a simple gradient, while the helmet highlights need to follow a cylinder shape. After that I apply yriel yellow roughly to those helmets. We really don't want them to look shiny and nice. Just roughly follow the shape with the highlight placement and you don't need maximum opacity. I mixed some skrag brown to the yellow later to smooth out the transition a bit because it was a quite big step. Blend in the layer with some glazing of skrag brown and pull the paint from the yellow part to the skrag brown part. For some shininess, I mix some karak stone to the ice yellow and apply the same stippling motion. These helmets on the ground probably fell or got busted up in an explosion. We don't want to make them smooth and shiny like Granny's butt cheek. Paint the rest of the metal parts with a mix of black and warpfiend grey. I'm dry brushing this color because Papa Laborc prefers to keep that little what left of his sanity, so the best way to paint the NMM on a grid-like texture or chainmail is to dry brush it, but very gently like we would touch Granny's face. Same with pure warpfiend grey, just reduce the highlight area and make sure that it's almost dried up between the bristles. Check the paint consistency on your hand or Granny's hand and don't apply any unnecessary pressure. Super gentle. I just barely feel the bristles touching the mini. Now add some ice yellow to the warpfiend grey and reduce the highlights even more. This way we have this rough NMM which is nice, but not too nice to draw the attention from the toenails, I mean the miniature. Lastly, glaze some wine red for the shadows and share your results with Papa Laborc if you followed this guide. There you go guys, Zombie Hulk is done and I think he looks quite cool and menacing. I hope you will have some fun painting him. So thank you for joining me on this little painting adventure. A huge thanks to my patrons who support this kind of videos. With special shout out to Jonathan Rhodes, Cold Blooded Dom, Trying to Paint Minis, Jonathan Mosner, Rulzak, Vlad D, Urtepel21, Paints and Games, and Joseph Ebenheim. If you want to support Papa Laborc, you can do that on Patreon where you will have early access to these videos and vote on the next mini. I hope the rest of your day will be as smooth as a granny's butt cheek.